Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Bean Family Stories channel. This is where we bring you interesting, funny, and inspiring stories from Mr. Bean family every day. You will meet me, Mr. Bean's son, someone you may be familiar with and I hope you love, my dad with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely sister who always brings positive energy with stories close to life. Every day, one of us will share new stories, interesting journeys, and today it's my turn. I will take you on an exciting adventure, but also profound lessons about life. Today's story carries a simple but important message. Never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprises waiting for us. If you like our family dynamic, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave some interesting comments to let me know what you think. Now, let's dive into today's story and dive into the world of surprises. Let's get started. Emily Carter walked through the bustling terminal of Boston Logan International Airport, the morning light filtering in through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was a crisp autumn day, and the usual hum of activity that came with the early morning flights was already in full swing. The noise from the overhead announcements, the rolling of suitcase wheels, and the murmurs of hurried passengers filled the air. Yet, amidst all this chaos, Emily moved with a calm, quiet confidence. At 34, she was used to navigating both the crowded terminals and the quieter moments of introspection, like today, as she prepared for her flight to San Francisco. Her blonde hair was tucked under a black cap, and her athletic build was dressed in a simple, dark gray sweatshirt paired with light gray sweatpants. She wasn't in a rush, not today. The modest silver bracelet she wore on her wrist was the only sign of luxury. Her outfit, though comfortable, didn't stand out among the other travelers, and she was perfectly content with that. To the casual observer, Emily might have appeared like just another passenger in line for a flight, one of the many people prioritizing comfort over style. But beneath the simplicity of her attire, Emily was a woman with a story that few knew. She was married to Ethan Carter, the billionaire founder of a successful tech empire. Ethan had recently acquired Summit Airlines, and it was something that she never flaunted. The life they led, their wealth, their position, none of it was something she felt the need to announce. Emily had always valued humility, staying grounded despite the world of privilege that came with her marriage. She glanced at her watch, a vintage piece that had belonged to her grandmother, now a sentimental reminder of her modest roots. Emily had plenty of time before boarding began for Summit Airlines Flight 923 to San Francisco, where she was scheduled to attend a climate research conference. The last thing she needed was to rush. She'd opted to take a commercial flight instead of using Ethan's private jet, a decision that often left people scratching their heads. But Emily liked the feeling of being around regular people, of not retreating into the bubble of wealth and privilege that so many in her circle often did. At the cafe near the gate, Emily ordered a simple black coffee, fishing a few dollars from her pocket instead of using the platinum card tucked away in her phone case. The young barista smiled at her, asking if she was headed somewhere special. "San Francisco for a family celebration," she replied, handing him the exact change. There was no need to elaborate. "Have a great flight," the barista said, handing her the coffee with a bright smile. "Thanks," Emily replied, her tone warm but not overly engaging. She wasn't one to linger in small talk. With coffee in hand, Emily made her way to Gate 22, where the first-class boarding lane had already started to form. As she walked, her eyes lingered on the families sitting together, the elderly couples holding hands, the business travelers typing away furiously on laptops. She was always fascinated by the variety of people she encountered at airports, the way lives converged for brief moments before they splintered again, never to cross paths again. Growing up in a small town in Colorado had made her more aware of the diversity of experiences that shaped each individual. There was something comforting in the randomness of it all, something grounding. She arrived at the gate, where the agent was already preparing to begin boarding. Now boarding first-class passengers for Summit Airlines Flight 923 to San Francisco, the gate agent announced, her voice echoing in the quiet space. Emily glanced at her boarding pass, a simple digital version on her phone, and stepped into the line for priority boarding. A man in an expensive suit ahead of her glanced over his shoulder at Emily's casual. The bustling terminal of Boston's Logan International Airport was alive with the usual hum of travelers. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows, casting a warm glow over the sea of people moving swiftly through the concourses. Emily Carter walked calmly through the crowd, her light gray sweatpants and dark gray hoodie standing in stark contrast to the business suits and high-end attire around her. Her blonde hair, tucked neatly under a black cap, gave her an air of casual simplicity. To the casual observer, she was just another traveler, a woman in her mid-30s on her way to catch a flight. But to anyone paying close attention, there was something subtly different about her. Emily's eyes scanned the terminal with a quiet curiosity. She had always been fascinated by the diverse cross-section of people that traveled through this airport. Families with small children, business executives huddled in serious conversations, and the occasional celebrity, all sharing the same space. To her, it was a reminder of how different life could be for everyone, depending on their circumstances. She often wondered if the people around her had any idea who she really was. Not that it mattered, of course. She had long ago grown accustomed to people not recognizing her for who she was, and in many ways she preferred it that way. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan. "Everything okay? I know you were flying today." She smiled softly at the message, but didn't reply immediately. He was likely busy with work. They had talked about her flying commercial for the trip to visit her parents in Boston, but she knew he preferred to travel privately. He had offered the company's jet, of course, but she liked the experience of traveling with the masses, the anonymity that came with blending in. It reminded her of simpler times, before the money, before the fame. "Just a regular coffee, please," she said to the barista at the terminal cafe, fishing some cash out of her pocket instead of using her platinum card. It was a small act of defiance against the wealth that constantly surrounded her. The young man behind the counter gave her a friendly smile as he handed over the coffee. "Going somewhere nice?" he asked. "Boston," she replied. "Family celebration." She tipped him generously before turning away, coffee in hand, and heading toward the gate. The quiet, familiar routine of it all made her feel grounded, like she was still connected to the world outside of her husband's empire. As she approached gate A22, she saw a group of families gathered near the boarding area. An elderly couple sat together, holding hands, and a young father was struggling to wrangle two toddlers who were more interested in running around than sitting still. The sight of it all made her smile. Family was important, and she hadn't spent enough time with hers in recent months. That was the reason for this trip. Her parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and it was important for her to be there, even if it meant enduring the occasional judgment of strangers while traveling. Now boarding first-class passengers for Summit Airlines Flight 782 to Boston. The gate agent called over the loudspeaker. Emily stood up straighter, pulling her small carry-on behind her. She joined the short line forming at the priority boarding lane, feeling the familiar stir of attention as the business travelers around her took in her casual appearance. It was nothing new. She had learned to ignore the curious glances and the occasional double-take. It was just a part of life now. A businessman in an expensive suit caught her eye and gave her a quick once-over, his expression one of mild confusion. She simply kept walking, her gaze steady ahead. As she reached the gate agent, a familiar ritual unfolded. "Boarding pass, please?" the agent asked, her smile polite but perfunctory. Emily handed over her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass. The agent scanned it quickly, then paused, her smile faltering slightly as her eyes flicked from the first-class designation to Emily's casual outfit. "Thank you, Miss Carter. Enjoy your flight," the agent said, her voice a little more strained than usual. Emily nodded with a polite smile, gathering her things and walking toward the jet bridge. She didn't think much of the agent's odd reaction, dismissing it as another case of a busy day at the airport. But little did she know, this small moment was about to set off a chain of events that would turn her world upside down. As Emily stepped into the first-class cabin of Summit Airlines Flight 782, A familiar sense of discomfort settled over her. The sleek, polished interior of the cabin, with its deep navy blue leather seats and polished wood accents, was a far cry from the casual coffee shop she'd just left behind. The gentle hum of pre-flight conversations filled the air, and she could hear the quiet clinking of glasses as the flight attendants prepared for departure. Her seat, 2A, was by the window, a spot she had carefully chosen to enjoy the view of the sprawling skies once they took off. She walked past the rows of passengers, her modest carry-on bag slung over her shoulder, feeling the familiar eyes of others land on her. Most of them were dressed in business attire, their polished shoes gleaming under the soft cabin lights. There was a celebrity chef in the front row, his face familiar from TV cooking shows, and a few executives whose names she vaguely recognized from the tech world. Everyone seemed to fit the mold of what first class should look like: confident, successful, polished. Emily, however, did not. Her light gray sweatpants and dark gray hoodie were an intentional choice, a symbol of her desire for comfort over pretense. She had been to enough high-powered events and meetings to know the value of appearances, but sometimes she just wanted to blend in, to be anonymous, to escape the weight of expectations that came with her status as the wife of Ethan Carter, a billionaire and tech mogul. As she approached her seat, she noticed the flight attendants standing at the front of the cabin, preparing to welcome passengers aboard. One of them, Diane Phillips, turned her gaze toward Emily, her smile freezing for just a second. It was a look that Emily had come to recognize all too well, the one that suggested she didn't belong. But she pushed the thought aside. It wasn't worth dwelling on. "Good morning," Emily said, her voice calm and warm as she walked toward her seat. 2A, window seat. Diane's smile was polite but lacked the warmth Emily had expected. "First class is to your left," Diane said, a hint of doubt creeping into her voice. Emily, unbothered, gave a small nod, acknowledging the instruction, and continued toward her seat without a second glance. She settled into the plush leather chair, her backpack resting on her lap. The seat next to her was empty, but it wouldn't be for long. First class was filling up quickly. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, glancing around the cabin as she did so. Her eyes met those of a businessman seated across the aisle from her, and he gave her a quick look that lingered just a moment too long. Emily recognized the judgment in his gaze, the same kind of silent assessment she had grown accustomed to. The look that questioned her right to be here, just because of what she was wearing. She didn't let it bother her. In fact, she had long since learned to shrug off these types of stares. There was no point in explaining herself to strangers. She had a first-class ticket, and that was all that mattered. Emily pulled a worn paperback book from her bag and opened it to the last chapter she had left off on, hoping to lose herself in the story and escape the reality of the situation. She had almost forgotten about the flight attendants and the stares from the passengers when she heard the soft footsteps of someone approaching. A male flight attendant, Richard, appeared at her side. His expression was neutral, but his tone was firm. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" he asked. Emily looked up from her book, meeting his gaze with a polite smile. She pulled her phone from her pocket, displaying the digital boarding pass. Richard took it from her with a practiced air, but instead of scanning it and walking away, he stood there, scrutinizing the screen. His eyes flicked from the boarding pass to Emily's outfit and back again. Emily's smile faltered as she felt the sudden weight of his gaze. She knew exactly what he was thinking, what everyone was thinking. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, Richard turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, disappearing behind the first-class divider. Emily watched him leave, her stomach knotting with the uncomfortable feeling of being judged. She took a deep breath and returned her attention to the pages of her book, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation in the pit of her stomach. A few minutes later, Richard returned, now accompanied by Diane. Emily's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The scrutiny of her appearance had gone from quiet judgment to something more serious. "Ma'am, we seem to have some confusion with your boarding pass," Diane said, her voice polite but cool. Emily closed her book and set it down, straightening in her seat. "There's no confusion," she replied evenly. "I'm in 2A first class." Diane's smile remained tight, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Our system sometimes makes mistakes," she said, her tone growing more insistent. "This seat is usually assigned to someone else. Could you show us some identification to confirm your reservation?" Emily's patience began to wear thin, but she kept her voice calm. "I've already shown my boarding pass twice now. There's no mistake," she replied, looking directly at Diane. "I've been assigned to this seat. I don't know what the issue is." Diane exchanged a quick glance with Richard, who had returned to stand nearby, arms crossed, his gaze focused intently on Emily. The quiet hum of conversation around them seemed to fade, replaced by the unmistakable tension in the air. The other first-class passengers, sensing something out of the ordinary, began to glance in their direction. Emily could feel their eyes on her, silently assessing, judging the situation, and wondering why she was being singled out. "This is a first-class cabin, ma'am," Diane continued, her tone now more curt. "Typically, our passengers are dressed in a manner that reflects the premium experience." Emily's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "So now it's about what I'm wearing?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of incredulity. She could feel the weight of judgment growing heavier, and the realization that this wasn't just about her boarding pass settled in her chest. It was about her appearance. It was about how she looked. Diane's eyes flickered with discomfort, but she maintained her professional veneer. "There's no official dress code," she began, her voice strained. "But our passengers generally present themselves in a way that is consistent with the expectations of this cabin." Emily's expression hardened, though she kept her voice even. "So, it's not about the ticket I purchased or my boarding pass, but about how I look?" She leaned back slightly in her seat, crossing her arms over her chest. "Is that what you're suggesting?" The discomfort on Diane's face was now palpable. Her smile wavered, her professionalism cracking. "Of course not, ma'am," she said quickly, though the words didn't carry the weight they once had. "We're just following procedure." "If you were following procedure, you wouldn't be questioning my right to sit in this seat at all," Emily replied, her tone direct. She looked around the cabin, her gaze meeting that of a distinguished older gentleman seated across the aisle. He was watching the exchange with growing concern, his newspaper forgotten on his lap. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice rising slightly. "I've flown in sweatpants in first class many times, and no one's ever questioned my right to be here. If this woman has a first-class ticket, then what's the issue?" Diane's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "Sir, this is between the staff and the passenger," she said, trying to regain some control of the situation. But the man wasn't having it. "I don't think it should be," he responded, his tone sharp. "This is an issue of respect. If you've got a problem with her ticket, then we all have a problem." Emily glanced at the older man, grateful for his support but also keenly aware that her being the center of attention was far from ideal. The whispered murmurs of other passengers filled the air now, a low buzz of curiosity and judgment. She could feel it, the way people were subtly taking sides, the way her presence was disrupting the carefully curated illusion of exclusivity in the cabin. Diane didn't respond to the man. Instead, she stepped closer to Emily, her voice dropping to a lower, more authoritative tone. "Ma'am," she began, "we need to confirm your identity. If we can't do that, we'll need to ask you to move to an economy seat." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. The blatant discrimination, the way she was being treated like an imposter simply because of how she looked, it was too much. "I'm not going to move," Emily said firmly, her voice steady. "I've already shown my boarding pass. This is my seat. If you want to move me, you'll have to make that decision. But I'm not leaving of my own volition." There was a beat of silence as Diane processed Emily's words. The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Richard stood just a few feet away, arms still crossed, his face a mask of professional indifference. Emily could feel his judgment, though, the way his eyes kept flicking to her casual attire, the quiet disapproval radiating from him. The flight attendants exchanged glances, and Emily could sense the gears turning behind their eyes. They had made an assumption, and now they had to deal with the consequences. "This is not how we handle things," Diane muttered, clearly flustered. She shot a glance at Richard, and then at the other passengers. "We'll need to complete boarding, ma'am. You're either going to need to verify your identity, or we'll have to ask you to move to economy class." Emily could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on her now. The quiet whispers had turned into full-fledged conversations. Some passengers were sympathetic, some were clearly uncomfortable, but Emily knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. This was about standing up against the kind of systemic bias that had been allowed to fester in places like this, places that were supposed to cater to people with privilege, but often only to those who fit a certain mold. She stood up from her seat slowly, making sure everyone could see her. "I want your names," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "And I want your employee numbers. This isn't over." The whispers grew louder now, and Emily noticed the sympathetic glances from a few of the passengers. But most of them, she knew, were just relieved it wasn't them being questioned. Diane, her face tight with frustration, led her through the cabin, her steps quick and almost aggressive. The walk of shame, Emily thought bitterly. She was being escorted from the one place she had every right to be, and yet, she couldn't let herself break. As they passed the business class section, Emily held her head high, refusing to show how deeply the humiliation cut. She could hear the muttered conversations behind her, the quiet gasps, the judgment. She wasn't just being moved to economy. She was being expelled from a place she'd paid for, humiliated in front of strangers who would likely forget her in a few days. But she wouldn't forget this moment. "Here you are," Diane said, her voice clipped, as she gestured toward an empty middle seat in economy. "We apologize for any inconvenience." The words were empty, hollow. But Emily wasn't listening to her anymore. Instead, she locked eyes with the woman who had stood in silence the entire time, one of the passengers who had watched everything unfold. She knew this wasn't just about one incident. It was about something much bigger, and she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The moment Emily stepped off the plane, the weight of the previous hour seemed to sink into her bones. The hum of the busy airport was still there, the usual buzz of voices and the shuffle of rolling luggage, but for her, it all felt muffled. She tried to shake off the feeling of humiliation, but it clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. Her steps were deliberate as she made her way through the terminal, following the signs to baggage claim. She glanced at the signs overhead, their bright neon arrows pointing the way to the different sections of the airport. It was a large place, bustling with people rushing to their destinations. Yet, for Emily, every person seemed to be staring at her. Every whisper felt like an accusation, every glance a judgment. She wished she could disappear into the crowd. She reached the baggage claim area and stood still for a moment, staring at the carousel as it slowly turned. It wasn't lost on her that this was what it felt like to be treated like everyone else. For a long time, she had been shielded by Ethan's wealth, by the privilege that came with his status. She never had to experience what it was like to be overlooked, judged, or questioned for something as trivial as appearance. She was used to people deferring to her, to treating her with respect because of who she was, or rather, who she was married to. But that didn't happen today. Today, she was just another passenger, one whose worth had been measured by her clothes. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her from her thoughts. This time, it was a message from Ethan. "How did the flight go?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. She could feel the pressure of having to explain what had happened. Ethan had been adamant about keeping things low-key, not using his influence to make waves. He had offered to send their private jet, but Emily had chosen to fly commercial. She wanted to stay grounded, to experience the world as it was, not as it was filtered through his wealth. Now she was rethinking that choice. Instead of responding immediately, she locked her phone and slipped it back into her bag. She didn't want to bother Ethan with this right now. He was busy. He had his own battles to fight, and she didn't want him to feel responsible for what had happened. Emily's eyes drifted to the baggage claim conveyor belt as it started to move, the first bags beginning to appear. She stepped closer, watching as they passed her by. She tried to focus on something, anything other than the scene that had unfolded on the plane. The confrontation, the embarrassment, the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than her clothes. As the bags passed by, she thought back to the moment when the flight attendants had asked her to leave first class. She had been calm, too calm for her own good. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let them see how much their actions hurt. Instead, she had stood there, quietly demanding accountability, knowing full well that this wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. This was about a culture of judgment, a culture that she had never fully understood until now. And that was why she had stayed quiet, why she hadn't revealed who she was to the flight attendants. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about putting them in their place. It was about showing them that their assumptions, their biases, had consequences. The carousel stopped, and Emily's attention snapped back to the moment. She grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder. She wasn't sure how long she'd been standing there, but it felt like an eternity. The weight of everything she had just experienced felt like it was pressing down on her chest. And yet, she wasn't crying. She wasn't angry either. She was just tired. The walk to the taxi stand was quiet, the noise of the airport fading into the background. Emily felt detached from everything, her body on autopilot as her mind wandered back to the flight, back to the cold, condescending tone of the flight attendants, to the way they had judged her not by her ticket, not by her boarding pass, but by her appearance. She had been humiliated in front of everyone on that plane. The worst part was, they didn't even seem to care. She reached the taxi stand and waved one down, stepping into the back seat and giving the driver her parents' address. She stared out the window, watching as the city of Boston whizzed by. The buildings, the people, the life happening outside the glass. It all seemed so far removed from what she had just gone through. The hum of the taxi engine, the smooth motion of the car on the road, was almost soothing, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts in her mind. What bothered her more than anything was that no one had stepped in. No one had said a word to defend her. The other passengers had simply watched, waiting for the scene to resolve itself. Some had even looked on with amusement, as if this was just another spectacle for their entertainment. But she had seen the sympathy in the eyes of others too. The older man, the one who had spoken up in her defense, had said something that lingered in her mind. If this woman has a first-class ticket, then what's the issue? What was the issue? As the taxi made its way through the streets of Boston, Emily tried to push the events of the morning out of her mind. The city was alive with the typical hustle and bustle. Pedestrians crossing busy intersections, cyclists weaving between cars, and the distant sound of street vendors calling out to passers-by. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel like a regular person, blending in with the crowd, just another face among many. But the memories of her confrontation on the plane kept creeping back, and the feeling of humiliation refused to leave. The car turned onto a quieter street, and Emily could see her parents' apartment building in the distance. It was a modest, old brownstone, the kind of place that had character but wasn't extravagant. It was exactly what Emily loved about it. Comfortable, warm, and familiar. She had grown up in places like this, far removed from the luxury she now lived in. Her parents were simple people, focused on family and the small joys in life. They had always supported her in her own path, regardless of where that had taken her. She wasn't sure what to expect when she walked through the door. Her parents had no idea what had happened on the flight. They were just looking forward to celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with their daughter. They wouldn't have known how much Emily needed this time away, how much she needed to feel like herself again. Before the wealth, before the expectations, and before the subtle but undeniable feeling of being trapped by her own success. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of the building, and Emily paid the driver, feeling a small pang of guilt for not telling him more about the tip. She stepped out, pulling her carry-on behind her, and looked up at the building. She felt a little lighter, knowing that here, at least, no one would judge her based on how she looked. Here, she was just Emily, the daughter who came home to visit her parents, and not the wife of a billionaire tech mogul. As she entered the building and made her way up the stairs to her parents' apartment, she tried to shake off the anger and frustration she still felt. She needed to be present for them, to enjoy the celebration they had been looking forward to. But deep down, something in her had shifted. She could no longer ignore the systemic biases, the ways in which people were judged based on nothing more than their appearance. The whole experience had exposed something in her, something she couldn't unsee. When she reached the door, she knocked softly. Her mother, with her bright smile and welcoming arms, opened the door almost immediately. "Emily," she exclaimed, enveloping her in a tight hug. "We're so glad you're here." "I'm glad to be here too," Emily said, returning the hug. It felt good to be held by her mother, who had always made her feel safe and loved. She stepped inside, where her father was already sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand. "Hey, kiddo," he said, looking up with a grin. "How was the flight? Everything good?" Emily hesitated for a moment. The instinct was there to just say it was fine and move on, but that didn't feel right. She had been raised to be honest with them, to share her thoughts even when it was uncomfortable. But how could she explain everything? How could she tell them about the discrimination, the way she had been treated like an outsider in a place where she had every right to be? Instead, she smiled and said, "The flight was fine, just a little eventful, but I'm glad to be here." Her father raised an eyebrow, sensing something was off. "Eventful? What happened?" "It's nothing really," Emily replied quickly, trying to brush it off. "It's just a little bit of a story for later. But right now, I'm just happy to be here with you both." Her mother, sensing the subtle change in Emily's demeanor, smiled knowingly. "You're here now, that's all that matters. We're just happy to have you here to celebrate with us. Let's not waste any time on travel stories." Emily nodded gratefully, thankful for her mother's ability to pivot the conversation. The warmth of her family's presence, the familiar smell of her mother's cooking filling the kitchen, made Emily feel a sense of peace that had eluded her all day. As they sat down to a simple but delicious dinner later that evening, Emily found herself laughing with her parents, relishing the quiet comfort of their company. It was a stark contrast to the tension and discomfort she had felt earlier. But even as they celebrated, there was a quiet storm brewing inside her. She couldn't ignore the lessons she had learned on that flight, about judgment, assumptions, and how easily people could be dismissed based on something as superficial as their appearance. That night, as she lay in the guest room of her parents' apartment, Emily stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The issue wasn't just with the flight attendants. It wasn't even just about her. It was about a larger system, one that judged people based on their appearance, their wealth, their status. And she realized she couldn't let it slide. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she had to take a stand. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a blur for Emily. The humiliation she had experienced on the flight still lingered, but she was determined to push forward. Her parents' anniversary celebration was in full swing, and she couldn't let herself dwell on what had happened. Yet, every time she closed her eyes or tried to relax, she was reminded of how deeply she had been judged, not for her actions or who she was, but for the simple fact that she didn't fit a preconceived image of who deserved to be in a place like first class. At dinner that evening, Emily sat quietly at the table, listening to the lively conversations around her. Her parents, as always, seemed to be the life of the party, telling stories of their early days together. Emily smiled, appreciative of the warmth they exuded. It was in these small, personal moments that she found peace. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being disconnected from her own world, like there was an invisible barrier between her and the people around her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Ethan. "I've got a meeting at Summit tomorrow. Want to join me for lunch afterward?" Emily hesitated before replying. The thought of being with him, of retreating back to the comfort of their shared life, felt like a relief. But at the same time, she knew that returning to her world would only serve to remind her of the gap that had widened between her and the world she used to know. The world where she had been judged for her clothes, where she had been treated as if she didn't belong. She quickly typed back, "I'll pass on lunch tomorrow. I think I need some space." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Emily wasn't sure what she needed, but she knew that being in the world of tech moguls and billion-dollar deals wasn't the answer. She needed to confront what had happened, to make sense of it, and to do something about it. That thought kept nagging at her, especially as she looked around the dinner table, surrounded by people who had never experienced a fraction of the prejudice she had. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains of the guest bedroom, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The noise of the city, the traffic outside her parents' window, seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Her mind kept returning to the plane, to Diane and Richard, to the way they had treated her. She was more than just a passenger. She was a person, a human being with a story, a history, and yet, she had been reduced to nothing more than her appearance. The sting of that judgment had cut deeper than she cared to admit. She knew what she had to do next. It wasn't about revenge or calling out the flight attendants in front of their peers. It wasn't even about making a scene or getting some sort of public apology. It was about changing the way people like Diane, Richard, and countless others thought. It was about making them understand that how you treat people shouldn't depend on how they look. It was about creating real change, not just for her, but for everyone who had been overlooked or dismissed because of something as simple as an outfit or a misunderstanding. She picked up her phone again and began drafting a message to Ethan. "I think I need to talk to someone at Summit. There's something I need to address. Something that can't be ignored anymore." She paused before hitting send, wondering if this would be the moment when everything changed. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but Emily wasn't surprised. He was busy, always working, always trying to juggle his responsibilities. She didn't expect him to drop everything for her. That wasn't how their relationship worked. Still, the message hung in the air, unspoken between them, a reminder that things couldn't go back to how they were. Not until she confronted the issue. Later that afternoon, as she sat on the balcony of her parents' apartment, sipping coffee and watching the world move by, her phone buzzed again. It was Ethan. "I spoke with Patricia Winters at Summit. They've agreed to meet with you. I told them you were upset, and they'll make time tomorrow afternoon." Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The first step toward making her voice heard. She didn't know exactly what she would say, but she knew she had to do something. Sitting by quietly wasn't an option anymore. She had experienced too much, seen too much to let it slide. The next day, Emily found herself standing in the lobby of Summit Airlines headquarters. The sleek, modern building stood tall, its glass facade reflecting the crisp, bright sky. The building itself seemed to symbolize everything that Ethan had worked for: success, ambition, and the kind of power that could change the world. But Emily didn't feel like she belonged here. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Her heels clicked on the marble floor as she walked toward the elevators. A young woman in a business suit smiled at her as she entered the elevator, but Emily barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, on the meeting she was about to have, on the words she needed to say. The doors closed, and she felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. Was this really the right thing to do? Was she about to make things worse? The elevator pinged, and the doors slid open to the top floor. Emily stepped out, greeted by the gleaming, pristine halls of Summit Airlines executive offices. As she approached Patricia Winters' office, she felt a sudden wave of doubt. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what she was about to do. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been subjected to the same kind of treatment. She couldn't turn back now. Patricia stood when Emily entered the room, offering a warm but somewhat strained smile. "Miss Carter, thank you for coming. I know you must be feeling a bit unsettled, but I'm glad you decided to meet with us." Emily nodded, her posture straight as she sat down across from Patricia. "I appreciate you taking the time to hear me out," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness simmering beneath the surface. "We've reviewed the situation, and I want to assure you, we take these matters seriously," Patricia continued, her tone professional but with an undercurrent of tension. Emily could tell Patricia was trying to maintain control of the conversation, to keep it from turning into something uncomfortable. But Emily wasn't going to let that happen. You said you take these matters seriously, Emily began, her voice firm now. But what exactly does that mean? Because from where I'm standing, what happened to me wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem, one that runs deep within your company's culture. Patricia blinked, caught off guard by Emily's directness. She recovered quickly, though nodding slowly. I understand that you're upset, and I agree that what happened was unfortunate, but we're committed to resolving these issues. Unfortunate, Emily repeated, her voice rising slightly. This wasn't just unfortunate. This was bias. This was discrimination. I was treated differently because of how I looked, not because of my ticket or my reservation. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Emily could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her pen. This wasn't going to be easy. I get that this might seem like a small thing to some people, Emily continued, her voice now a bit softer but still firm. But the fact is, it happens all the time. People get overlooked. They get judged. And it's not just in your company. It's everywhere. I've been that person. I've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. But what happened to me, what happened on that plane, was different. It wasn't just about being asked for my ID. It was about being told, in 1,000 little ways, that I didn't belong. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of her words hanging between them. Emily could see Patricia processing what she had said. Her lips pressed together in a tight line. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but Emily wasn't finished. Until you acknowledge this, until you truly understand the gravity of what happened, nothing will change, Emily said, her voice now calm but resolute. I don't want to see another person go through this. I don't want to see someone else treated like I was, simply because they don't fit some narrow, superficial standard of who gets to sit in first class. Patricia sat back in her chair, her face unreadable. Emily felt her chest tighten, the weight of the moment heavy on her. This was the beginning of something important, something that could bring real change. And it all started with her. The days that followed Emily's meeting with Patricia Winters at Summit Airlines were a whirlwind of activity. But the feeling of tension hadn't left her. She spent most of the time with her parents, trying to focus on the anniversary celebrations, but her mind kept returning to the conversation in the corporate office. Patricia had promised action, assurances that Summit Airlines would address the issue of bias and work toward a more inclusive environment. But Emily knew better than to rely on empty promises. She had seen firsthand how companies often paid lip service to issues like this without truly changing anything. Ethan had been supportive, of course, but he had been caught up in his own whirlwind of meetings and deadlines. She could tell that he was concerned, but she didn't want him to fix it for her. This was something she had to do herself. The experience on the plane had opened her eyes to a larger issue, one that stretched beyond her own personal humiliation. It was about the systemic problem that still existed, about the way society judged people based on their appearance or their status. And Summit Airlines was no exception. Emily had been sitting at the kitchen table in her parents' apartment that morning, reading through the latest headlines on her phone when she received another message from Ethan. Patricia wants to meet again tomorrow. She says they've made some changes, and they want you to hear about them. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had expected follow-up, but she hadn't realized how quickly it would come. She had hoped that the company would make real, tangible changes, but hearing that they were ready to present their solution so quickly felt like a small victory. She quickly typed back, "I'll be there." The next day, she found herself once again stepping into the glass and steel headquarters of Summit Airlines. The building looked even more imposing now, its sleek design a stark contrast to the simple, grounded life she had grown up with. As she entered the lobby, the familiar feeling of discomfort crept in again. She knew that the people inside these walls didn't see her as just another person. They saw her as someone who had the power to influence change, someone with connections. And that made her feel more isolated than ever. Patricia greeted her with the same professional smile, though this time, there was something more genuine in her expression. "Thank you for coming back so quickly, Miss Carter," she said, motioning for Emily to sit down. "We've spent the last few days reviewing our policies and procedures. We want to ensure something like what happened to you never happens again. Emily nodded, her arms folded across her chest. I hope you've truly taken the time to listen, because this isn't just about one incident. This is about how people are treated every day based on their appearance, their clothing, or their perceived status. And it needs to stop. Patricia's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. I understand, Emily, and I want to assure you that we are taking immediate action. We've consulted with experts in diversity, inclusion, and bias training, and we're implementing a new company-wide initiative aimed at addressing these issues head-on. Emily raised an eyebrow. And what does that look like? We're introducing mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, starting with our flight attendants and gate agents, Patricia explained. We'll also be revising our customer service policies to ensure no one is ever judged based on their appearance again. And we're putting in place a new feedback system that will track and address any complaints regarding discrimination. Emily listened carefully, her mind racing. It sounded promising, but she had seen similar initiatives fail in the past. Companies often made grand statements without ever following through. And how do you plan on measuring success? She asked, her voice steady. We'll be tracking customer satisfaction and internal feedback from our employees. Additionally, we're going to open up channels for passengers to report any discriminatory behavior they experience, Patricia said. This is about creating a cultural shift. It won't happen overnight, but we're committed to it. Emily nodded, though her skepticism remained. She had heard all this before, corporate talk, promises of change that never materialized. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this time would be different. I want to see results, Emily said firmly. I don't just want to hear promises. I want accountability. Patricia met her gaze. I understand, and I can promise you that we will be accountable. We're taking this very seriously. The meeting wrapped up with Patricia assuring Emily that she would be kept in the loop throughout the implementation of these changes. As Emily walked out of Summit Airlines headquarters, a sense of cautious optimism settled over her. For the first time since the incident, she felt like something real might come out of this. But she knew the true test would be in the follow-through, whether Summit Airlines actually committed to their words or if it was just another fleeting corporate initiative. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed with another message from Ethan. How did it go? Did they listen? Emily paused for a moment before replying, typing out a brief response. They're making changes. It's a step in the right direction, but we'll see if they follow through. I'll keep you posted. She didn't want to burden Ethan with the weight of her doubts, though they lingered in the back of her mind. There was still so much work to be done. The issue was never just about Summit Airlines, it was about changing a mindset, a culture. It was about challenging society's tendency to judge people based on superficial traits and taking action to correct it. When she returned to her parents' apartment that evening, the weight of the day's events still hung heavily on her. The city outside was quiet, the sound of distant traffic and rustling leaves the only noise that filled the silence of the apartment. Emily sat down at the small kitchen table, her coffee cooling in front of her as she thought about the meeting and everything that had led up to it. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Patricia Winters. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello, Emily? Patricia's voice came through, calm but tinged with urgency. I wanted to follow up with you on our conversation earlier. We've been looking over the details of the training program, and we feel it's essential that we involve you in the process. You've been a key voice in this, and we'd like your input on how we can make it as effective as possible. Emily felt a mix of surprise and appreciation. It wasn't often that companies were willing to involve the affected individuals in the changes they were making. But it also felt like a sign that Summit Airlines was serious about this. I'd be happy to help however I can, Emily said, her voice steady. I think it's important to get this right. I've seen firsthand how much damage unchecked biases can cause. If I can be a part of this process, I will. Patricia's tone softened. We're committed to making this work, Emily, and we believe having your perspective will ensure we don't miss anything. You've been through this, and your insight will be invaluable. As they discussed the details of the next steps, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of validation. It wasn't about the apology, the pity, or even the recognition. It was about change. Real change. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was actively contributing to the solution. The following weeks were filled with meetings, discussions, and collaborative sessions with Summit Airlines leadership team and outside diversity consultants. Emily worked closely with them, offering her perspective on what the training needed to include and ensuring that it would be more than just a surface-level gesture. She spoke about the subtle ways that people, especially those in service industries, could perpetuate biases without even realizing it. She shared personal stories, explaining how the experiences she had gone through could be echoed by countless other passengers, but that they often went unnoticed or ignored. The training program began to take shape with a focus on empathy, understanding, and unlearning prejudices that had been ingrained in people for years. It wasn't just about making sure that no one was turned away from first class for their appearance. It was about creating a culture where all passengers, regardless of how they looked, were treated with equal respect and dignity. But there was still more work to do. Emily knew that even with the best training, changing the culture of an entire company, especially one as large as Summit Airlines, wasn't a simple task. It would take time, effort, and a commitment to accountability that extended far beyond a one-time workshop or training seminar. She needed to make sure that Summit's leadership stayed dedicated to the cause. And then, one day, while she was reviewing the latest feedback from the training program, Emily received a call that would change everything. Ethan's phone call came at just the right time. Emily had spent the morning at Summit Airlines headquarters, discussing the implementation of the new diversity training program with Patricia and the other executives. It had been an intense session, with multiple discussions about how to reframe the company's approach to customer service and how best to address the biases that had been entrenched for so long. Despite the positive momentum, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the real work was only beginning. The changes being implemented, while important, were just the first step. What Emily wanted, what she needed, was accountability. She had seen firsthand how easy it was for companies to say the right things, to make grand promises, and then quietly slip back into old habits. Summit Airlines, for all its commitment, still had to prove it could walk the walk, not just talk the talk. As she sat at the kitchen table in her parents' apartment, going over notes from the meeting, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. With a sigh, she set the papers aside and answered. "Hey, Emily," Ethan said, his voice as steady and reassuring as ever. "I've been thinking about everything you're doing with Summit. I know you're pouring a lot into it. How are you feeling about everything?" Emily leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. The program's taking shape, but I'm still worried it's not enough. The real challenge isn't just changing policies, it's changing mindsets. I'm just not sure Summit can truly follow through. You know?" Ethan's tone softened. "I get it. It's a huge challenge. But you're doing something important. You're forcing the company to confront its biases, and that's not easy. You've already made a massive impact, whether they admit it or not." "I know, but I want more," Emily said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I want them to be accountable. I want to see real change, not just empty gestures." Ethan paused before speaking again. "I understand. And I know you're not someone who's going to stop until you're satisfied with the results. You're strong, Emily. You've always been. But don't forget to take care of yourself through all of this. You can't pour from an empty cup." Emily smiled softly at his words. "I know, but it's hard. Feels like I'm carrying this huge weight, and it's not just for me anymore. It's for everyone who's been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly because of how they look or where they come from." Ethan's voice was steady but filled with understanding. "You're doing this for a reason, and I'm proud of you. You've always been someone who wants to make a difference. Just don't lose sight of who you are in the process." The warmth in his voice brought her a sense of comfort, but the weight of the task at hand still felt overwhelming. Emily had never been the type to shy away from hard work, but this was different. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a lasting change that could affect the lives of countless people who, like her, had been judged by the way they looked rather than who they truly were. Ethan had always supported her, and his words meant the world to her. But Emily knew this fight was hers to carry. She had started this journey because she couldn't stand by and watch others be treated the way she had been. And now, more than ever, she was committed to seeing it through. The next few days were a whirlwind. Emily attended more meetings, reviewed documents, and helped shape the new customer feedback systems that Summit Airlines was implementing. Despite the constant flow of activity, the doubt still lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of the company's image campaign, a way to put a band-aid on a much deeper issue. It was hard for Emily to know who to trust. The people in leadership at Summit were saying the right things, but were they really committed to making a lasting change? Or was this just a response to a PR disaster? Emily had no answers, but what she did know was that she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she'd seen. One evening, after another long day at Summit, Emily found herself sitting in a quiet cafe near her parents' apartment. The place was warm, its small tables tucked into cozy corners. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, offering a momentary escape from the tension she had been carrying. She ordered a cappuccino, finding solace in the simple routine. The barista smiled at her as she handed over her drink, and Emily took a seat by the window, looking out at the city street. She tried to relax, but her mind raced. The issues at Summit were just the tip of the iceberg. She knew this kind of bias existed everywhere, and not just in the airline industry. It was in every corner of society, from businesses to schools to social spaces. The kind of judgments that led to people being treated differently because of their appearance, race, or economic status. Emily had seen it firsthand in ways both big and small. She had felt it herself, especially during her early days with Ethan, when she was constantly treated differently because of her status as a tech mogul's wife. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about being overlooked or judged for the clothes she wore. It was about changing the entire culture around how people were treated, how society viewed them. As Emily sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Winters. "Can you come to Summit headquarters tomorrow? We've got some updates we'd like to discuss." Emily's stomach fluttered. She knew this was coming, but a part of her wasn't ready to hear whatever Summit had to offer next. Still, she typed a quick response, "I'll be there." The next morning, she arrived at Summit Airlines headquarters, the glass doors reflecting her image as she walked through. She was met by Patricia and a few other executives in a sleek, modern conference room. A large screen displayed a presentation on the wall, and a series of charts and graphs showed the initial impact of the new bias training program they had implemented. "Emily, thank you for coming," Patricia said warmly as she gestured to an empty seat. "We've made some progress, and we're excited to share it with you. The feedback from our first round of training has been overwhelmingly positive, and we've already seen improvements in how our customer-facing staff are handling passenger interactions." Emily sat down, though she couldn't completely mask her skepticism. She had heard these kinds of reports before, the ones that promise progress but failed to deliver anything substantial. "That's great," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of doubt. "But what kind of progress are we talking about? Are you seeing a real shift in how employees are treating passengers? Or is this just surface level?" Patricia nodded, clearly prepared for Emily's skepticism. "We've implemented a follow-up survey system, and we're actively tracking customer satisfaction. The results so far show a decrease in complaints about discrimination, particularly in our first-class cabins. We're also seeing a shift in staff behavior, more awareness, more empathy." Emily absorbed the information, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that the company was trying to push the issue under the rug. "That's a start," she said cautiously. "But we need more than just customer surveys. I want accountability at every level. You need to make sure this becomes ingrained in your company culture, not just something employees are doing because they're being watched." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly as she processed Emily's words. "And that's exactly why we wanted you here. We don't just want to make this a one-time training. We want it to be part of our long-term strategy. We've been discussing the possibility of creating a diversity and inclusion board, one that will monitor these issues on an ongoing basis." Emily sat back, her expression thoughtful. This was the first time she had heard Summit speak about an initiative with the depth she had hoped for. A board? She asked, her tone cautious. What would that look like? We'd bring in a mix of internal and external advisors, Patricia explained. People with real-world experience who can help us maintain momentum, ensure the training is truly effective, and make sure we're held accountable to the changes we're implementing. Emily's mind raced with the possibilities. This could be what Summit needed, a real, lasting change, not just a response to a single incident. But even then, she knew it wouldn't be easy. Culture change was never quick, and it had to start with the right people being in charge. That sounds promising, Emily said, her voice steady. But we need to ensure that the right people are in those positions. You need diversity at the table, not just in the staff, but in the leadership. Otherwise, this will be another token effort. Patricia nodded. We hear you. We're committed to doing this right, and we want you to be a part of that process. Your perspective is invaluable. The weeks following Emily's last meeting with Summit Airlines had been a blur. While Summit had made strides in addressing the issues of bias within their company, the road to lasting change was long and filled with obstacles. Emily had become increasingly involved in the creation of a diversity and inclusion board, one that would hold the company accountable to its promises and ensure that the changes they were making were more than just surface-level adjustments. She found herself spending more time at Summit's headquarters than she had ever anticipated. Every meeting, every decision felt crucial, like the future of the airline was hanging in the balance. Despite the progress, the work was far from easy. There were internal roadblocks, resistance from employees who hadn't fully grasped the depth of the changes needed, and the constant pressure to ensure that everything stayed on track. It wasn't just the airline industry that needed reform, it was the way society had been conditioned to view people based on appearance, status, and privilege. Emily had seen how pervasive this was, not just at Summit, but in every corner of her life. She had spent years in circles where appearances meant everything, where success was measured by how well you fit into a mold. And she had broken free of that, but not without cost. One afternoon, as she sat in a conference room with Summit's top executives, she received a text from Ethan. How's it going? I know things have been intense. Emily smiled briefly at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered her reply. She hadn't seen Ethan in days, both of them consumed by their own commitments. The physical distance between them had started to mirror the emotional distance, though neither of them ever said it out loud. She quickly typed back, busy, but progress is being made. Still a long way to go. As she hit send, she realized how much she missed him. His steady presence, his understanding. But this was her fight, her mission. She couldn't ask him to carry the burden with her. The stakes were too high. The meeting at Summit continued, and Emily felt herself growing more frustrated with each passing hour. They were making progress, but it felt too slow, too fragmented. She wanted immediate results. She wanted every person at Summit, from the top executives down to the frontline employees, to internalize the lessons they were learning. She wanted them to feel the urgency of the moment. The conversation shifted to the next phase of the diversity training program, and Emily's mind wandered. She had seen firsthand the impact of the training. They had already started seeing positive feedback from passengers, with fewer complaints about discrimination. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just teach employees to be kinder or more aware. She wanted to see systemic changes, the kind that would ripple out from Summit Airlines into the broader culture. Emily, what do you think? Patricia Winters, the chief customer officer, asked, pulling her back into the discussion. Emily blinked, refocusing. I think we need to move faster. We need to create a clear, measurable system of accountability, something that shows we're serious about these changes. Not just training, but actual consequences for bias. And I want to ensure we're involving the communities most impacted by this in the process. Patricia nodded, though Emily could see the slight hesitation in her eyes. The idea of involving external parties in the decision-making was something that hadn't been fully explored yet. There was always the concern that it would make the process more complicated, more challenging. Are you suggesting we bring in outside consultants or community groups? One of the executives asked. Yes, Emily responded without hesitation. We need people who've lived through this. We need to be informed by the experiences of those who face bias every day, whether it's on a plane, in a store, or at the workplace. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. Emily could feel the tension, the uncertainty. Not everyone was on board with the idea of giving more influence to external groups. But Emily wasn't backing down. This was the key to real, lasting change. This wasn't about being polite or avoiding uncomfortable conversations. It was about making sure the company listened to the voices that had been ignored for far too long. "I'll work on connecting with community leaders," Patricia said, breaking the silence. "We'll make it happen." Emily nodded, satisfied for the moment. But she knew the work was far from over. Summit Airlines could take the first step, but it was up to all of them, every employee, every customer, to keep pushing for change. The following weeks were filled with calls, emails, and meetings as Emily worked closely with Summit Airlines and various community leaders to create a program that would ensure the diversity and inclusion efforts were sustained over time. The airline had begun to establish stronger relationships with advocacy groups, and Emily was pleased to see that the external voices they were bringing in weren't just tokens. They were active participants in shaping the direction of the company. Despite the progress, there was a lingering unease in the back of Emily's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the broader issue wasn't just within Summit. The biases that were being confronted here were everywhere, ingrained in society in ways that felt almost insurmountable. And while Summit Airlines was making strides, she knew that true change required more than just internal policy reform. It required a shift in cultural norms, one that couldn't be achieved overnight. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings and brainstorming sessions, Emily found herself sitting in her parents' apartment, staring out at the city skyline. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ethan. "I've been thinking about what you said last week. Maybe we should take a break. Just the two of us, a weekend away. I think you need it." The idea of getting away, of taking a step back from everything she had been juggling, was tempting. She missed the quiet moments with Ethan, the ones that didn't involve Summit or tech moguls, or the endless conversations about bias and corporate reform. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more work to be done. As if reading her mind, Ethan texted again. "You've been pouring yourself into this, and I get it, but I'm worried you're burning out. You need to take care of yourself, too." Emily stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. She had been so consumed by the mission, by the need to see real change, that she had neglected her own well-being. She had stopped seeing the beauty in the small moments, the laughter with her parents, the quiet moments with Ethan, the joy of simply being in a moment without constantly planning for the next step. After a moment of contemplation, she replied, "You're right. Maybe we do need to get away. Let's plan it for next weekend." The decision felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, even if just for a short while. She needed to rest, to recharge, and to find clarity in the midst of everything. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to look forward to something other than the work ahead. A weekend with Ethan, just the two of them, away from the noise of the world, felt like exactly what she needed. It was a crisp autumn weekend when Emily and Ethan finally found the time to escape their busy lives. They had decided to take a quiet trip to a small cabin in the mountains of Vermont, a place far away from the pressures of Summit Airlines, the constant stream of emails, and the weight of the mission Emily had been carrying for so long. The drive was peaceful, with the golden and red leaves of fall lining the winding roads. Emily had always loved the changing of the seasons, the way nature could reset everything, offering a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, things could always begin anew. The idea of a weekend away felt almost foreign at first. Her mind was so wrapped up in the work she had been doing at Summit, she couldn't remember the last time she had truly been able to relax. As they arrived at the cabin, nestled at the edge of a quiet forest, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. The smell of pine trees and fresh air was intoxicating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could hear nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Ethan carried their bags inside, and Emily stood by the window, taking in the view. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with large windows that allowed the sun to flood the interior. There was a fireplace in the living room, with a fire already crackling in the hearth, giving the place a warm, welcoming feel. She could hear Ethan moving around, setting things up, but for the first time in months, she wasn't in a rush. She wasn't thinking about meetings or training programs or how many emails she needed to respond to. Ethan came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "This place is perfect, isn't it?" he whispered. Emily closed her eyes, leaning into him. "Yeah, it's exactly what we needed." They stood there for a few moments, just taking it all in. The beauty of the mountains, the peace of the cabin, and the feeling of being removed from everything. She didn't have to be Emily Carter, the changemaker, the person pushing for reform anymore. She could just be Emily, the woman who loved being with her husband, who appreciated simple moments like this one. As they settled in, they spent the day hiking through the woods, picking wildflowers, and taking photographs of the scenery. They talked about everything and nothing, about their childhoods, about their dreams, about what they wanted for their future. It felt like a lifetime since they had been able to have such an uninterrupted conversation. Even when they had been together, they often found themselves caught in the whirlwind of their respective careers. Now, there was no rush, no demands on their time, just the quiet comfort of each other's company. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky painted itself in hues of pink and orange, Emily sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the light fade from the landscape. Ethan joined her, holding 2 glasses, and handed one to her before sitting down beside her. "This is nice," Emily said, her voice quiet but content. "I've needed this more than I realized." Ethan smiled and took a sip of his wine. "I think we both have. You've been so focused on Summit, on everything that's going on there. It's good to see you actually enjoying a moment, without the weight of it all." Emily leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment. "I didn't realize how much I was carrying until now. It's like everything had built up, and I was so focused on changing the world that I forgot to take care of myself." Ethan gently nudged her shoulder. "You've always been someone who wants to make a difference. But remember, you can't change the world if you're running on empty." She looked at him, feeling the truth of his words sink in. Ethan had always been her grounding force, the one who reminded her that balance was just as important as ambition. She hadn't been listening to him enough lately. She had been so consumed by the work, by the need to create change, that she had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, her own well-being. "I know you're right," Emily said, her voice soft. "But it's hard, you know? I feel like there's so much to be done. So many people need help, and I want to be the one to make sure they're heard." Ethan took her hand, squeezing it gently. "And you will. But change takes time. And the people who love you, who care about you, need to be a part of that journey. Don't carry it all by yourself." Emily smiled, the weight she had been carrying beginning to feel just a little bit lighter. It wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about knowing when to lean on the people who cared, and when to step back and take a breath. This weekend, this time with Ethan, was just the reminder she needed. As the evening progressed, the fire crackled in the background, and the warmth from the flames wrapped around them like a blanket. They spent hours talking, sharing stories they hadn't thought about in years, laughing over little memories, and savoring the peace that came from simply being present with one another. Emily realized how much she had missed this, how much she had missed him, the quiet moments, the intimacy that came from not having to be anyone other than who they were together. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the crisp night sky. The night was still, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to be fully present, to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying slip away, if only for a few hours. "I've been thinking about Summit," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I know I've made progress. I can see that things are changing. But it still doesn't feel like enough. I still don't feel like I've made the impact I want to." Ethan turned toward her, his expression soft but concerned. "You're already making a difference, Emily. Every step you take, every voice you amplify, it matters. It's going to take time, But you're already doing the hard part. You've opened people's eyes. That's the first step. She nodded, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. Is it enough? She had pushed herself so hard, fought so relentlessly for change, but deep down, she wasn't sure if what she had done would truly create the lasting impact she envisioned. She had made Summit more accountable, but what about the rest of the world? The biases that ran through every corner of society? The culture of judgment that influenced how people were treated every single day. Maybe it's just me, she said with a sigh. I feel like there's more to do, but I'm not sure what it is yet. I'm not sure how to keep this momentum going, how to make it last. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle, yet firm. You've already built the foundation. You're not doing this alone. You've got the support of Summit, the community groups, the employees who've already started to change their perspectives. And you've got me. Whatever you need to keep going, we'll do it together. Emily smiled, her heart warmed by his words. I don't know what I'd do without you, she said softly. I don't think I could do any of this without knowing you have my back. Ethan squeezed her hand. You've always had my back. You've just been so focused on what you're fighting for that you forgot about the people who are fighting with you. The conversation lulled for a moment, both of them lost in their thoughts, watching the night unfold around them. Emily let herself lean against Ethan, feeling the comfort of his presence and the quiet strength he offered. It was a reminder that she didn't have to fight this battle alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. The next morning, they woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of the sun rising over the mountains. Emily felt more rested than she had in weeks. The previous day had given her the clarity she needed. She wasn't done with her work at Summit, but she had learned to step back and allow herself to rest, to breathe. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was ready to face it with renewed determination. After breakfast, they decided to take a hike through the surrounding trails. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the colors of fall. As they walked, Emily felt the familiar tug of purpose return to her. The work was far from over, but she could see the road ahead more clearly now. It wasn't about rushing to the finish line. It was about taking it one step at a time, making sure each decision, each change was meaningful. As they reached a clearing at the top of the trail, Emily stopped and took in the view. The mountains stretched endlessly into the distance, the vastness of the world reminding her of how small, and yet how significant her actions were. I think I'm ready, Emily said, turning to Ethan. Ready to go back. Ready to push forward with everything. But this time I'm going to do it with balance. With purpose. I'm not going to let it consume me. Ethan smiled and nodded, taking her hand in his. I'm proud of you, Emily. You've already done so much, and I know you'll keep doing more. Together, they stood there for a moment, hand in hand, watching the world spread out before them. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Emily felt more confident than ever that she was on the right path. The following weeks brought a renewed sense of purpose for Emily. She had returned from her short getaway with Ethan, her mind clearer, her body more rested. But the work ahead of her was daunting. Summit Airlines had made substantial progress in terms of their diversity and inclusion initiatives, but the true test was just beginning. The company had begun rolling out the first phase of their new bias training program. The results were promising, with initial feedback indicating a shift in how some employees approached passenger interactions. But Emily knew better than to celebrate too early. This was only the beginning. Real, lasting change took time and constant evaluation. Summit's leadership team, though supportive, was also beginning to show signs of fatigue. The weight of the task ahead was starting to show on their faces. Some executives began to question if the ongoing efforts were worth the investment, while others felt the pressure to move faster, to see results now. Emily had spent countless hours in meetings, trying to maintain momentum, but the cracks were starting to show. It was clear to her that the biggest challenge wasn't going to be changing the company's policies. The hardest part was going to be changing the culture, the ingrained mindset of employees who had never questioned their assumptions or biases. As Emily sat in one of Summit's many meeting rooms, listening to the latest round of presentations, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her responsibility. She had pushed so hard for this moment, for these changes, and yet she knew that it was only the tip of the iceberg. What was happening at Summit Airlines could be a blueprint for other companies, but it wouldn't matter unless it was sustained and meaningful. Emily, Patricia Winters, Summit's chief customer officer, called from across the table, interrupting her thoughts. We've seen a drop in complaints about discrimination, but we're still hearing from some passengers who feel overlooked. We need to address this. What's your take? Emily sat up straighter, focusing on the question at hand. The complaints we're seeing now aren't about policy. They're about culture, she replied, her voice steady. You can train employees all you want, but if the culture doesn't shift, nothing will change. People will still make assumptions based on appearance, and they'll still act on them even unconsciously. There was a moment of silence around the table as the executives absorbed her words. Patricia, who had been at the forefront of the diversity initiatives, nodded slowly. So, what do you suggest? We need to take a deeper dive into the company's culture, Emily said, looking around the room. The training is a good start, but we need more than that. We need to create a long-term strategy that focuses on accountability. We can't just rely on annual training sessions. We need to have regular check-ins, anonymous reporting, and a system for measuring the success of the cultural shift. Patricia leaned forward, her expression serious. And how do we get there? It starts with leadership, Emily said firmly. Leadership needs to model the behavior we want to see. If the executives here aren't truly invested in the change, it won't trickle down to the rest of the company. We also need to have real conversations with employees, frontline staff, flight attendants, gate agents, about what this training means to them and how it can be implemented on a day-to-day basis. The room grew quieter as the team took in her words. Emily knew it wouldn't be easy to get everyone on board, especially when they had already put so much effort into the current initiatives. But she was determined. She had come too far to back down now. The next step is crucial, Emily continued. We need to make sure the people who are doing the work on the ground, the flight attendants, the gate agents, are not only trained but supported. We need to ensure that they feel comfortable reporting issues without fear of retaliation. That's where the anonymous feedback system comes in. We need a system that allows employees to voice concerns and feel heard, without worrying about the consequences. Patricia nodded, looking thoughtful. I agree. We'll have to get buy-in from the senior leadership team, but I think it's something we can start implementing in the next quarter. Emily felt a surge of determination. This was the challenge she had been preparing for. It wasn't enough to change the training programs or add a few diversity initiatives. She needed to push harder to ensure that the cultural shift would be long-lasting. As the meeting continued, Emily's mind raced with ideas. She could already envision the steps they needed to take to make Summit Airlines a true leader in inclusive customer service. But she also knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. Challenges that would require every ounce of her strength and perseverance. As the days passed, Emily threw herself into the work, helping shape the next phase of Summit Airlines' transformation. She had pushed for the implementation of anonymous feedback systems, and now they were in the process of integrating it into the employee reporting tools. This system would give the staff an outlet to express their concerns without fear of retaliation, allowing for a more open dialogue about biases and discrimination. But even as the system took shape, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenges ahead. Getting everyone to buy into this shift was going to be harder than anyone realized. The anonymous feedback system was crucial, but it was just one part of a larger puzzle. Emily had insisted on regular follow-up surveys, not just for customers but for employees as well. She wanted to make sure that Summit Airlines wasn't just addressing the symptoms but the root causes of bias and exclusion. She was adamant about collecting real data, analyzing trends, and adjusting the company's strategy as needed. This wasn't something that could be fixed with one-off initiatives. It required ongoing commitment and, more importantly, transparency. Still, the company's leadership team was behind her every step of the way. They had been tentative at first, hesitant to make big, bold moves for fear of backlash, but Emily had been able to convince them of the importance of leading by example. They had agreed to a set of measurable goals and key performance indicators, KPIs, to track the success of the program. For the first time, Summit Airlines was being held accountable not just to its customers but to its employees, too. As Emily looked around the room during a strategy session, she could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The executives were beginning to see the benefits of this approach, not just in terms of customer satisfaction but in employee morale. People were starting to feel heard, and that made all the difference. There was still a lot of work to do, but the foundation was solid, and momentum was on their side. "Emily, how do you feel about the next steps?" Patricia asked, pulling her out of her thoughts. The room was quiet, the team waiting for her feedback. They had already made significant progress, but Emily knew they couldn't afford to get complacent. This was just the beginning. "I think we're on the right path, but it's not enough to just put these systems in place," Emily said, her voice steady but passionate. "We need to ensure that this becomes part of the fabric of the company. It has to be woven into everything we do, from how we hire to how we interact with passengers. Every touchpoint, every interaction, needs to reflect the values we're promoting." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "Agreed. And we need to make sure the rest of the employees see this as something that's here to stay, not just a trend that will fade out." Emily smiled, feeling the familiar rush of determination. "Exactly. It's not just about the training anymore. It's about the cultural shift. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe and respected, regardless of what they wear, where they come from, or what they look like." As the discussion continued, Emily felt a growing sense of pride in the work they were doing. There had been so many moments when she had doubted whether this would ever lead to real change. But now, she could see the beginnings of that change, and it was far more than she had imagined. Summit Airlines was evolving, and so was she. The road ahead still had its challenges, but for the first time in months, Emily felt like the weight on her shoulders was a little lighter. The following week, Summit Airlines launched its first company-wide diversity and inclusion summit. It was a huge step forward for the airline, and Emily had been instrumental in planning the event. She had invited guest speakers from various advocacy groups, including those that focused on racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, and disability awareness. The goal was to not only highlight Summit's progress but to engage employees on a deeper level and invite them into the conversation. The day of the summit, Emily stood at the front of the conference room, addressing a sea of employees, flight attendants, pilots, gate agents, managers, and executives, all gathered to listen, to learn, and to be part of something bigger than themselves. It was a diverse group, representing the very essence of the company's mission: to serve all passengers, regardless of background, with the same respect and dignity. As she spoke, Emily felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had fought for this moment, and now it was happening. She could see the faces in the crowd, their expressions attentive, curious, and, most importantly, open. This was the kind of cultural shift she had hoped for. This wasn't just a training program, it was a movement. "Change is never easy," Emily said to the crowd, her voice firm but hopeful. "But it is necessary. We are responsible for creating an environment where every single person feels they belong, whether they're a passenger or an employee. Today, we're not just talking about policies or training. We're talking about who we are as a company, as a community, and we have the power to shape that." There was a moment of silence, and then a round of applause rippled through the room. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She knew there was still much to be done, but this moment, this summit, was a symbol of everything they had worked for. And it was just the beginning. The following months were a blur of progress and setbacks for Emily. Summit Airlines had made significant strides in the diversity and inclusion efforts, but the road to systemic change was never straightforward. The feedback systems were in place, and the employees were now more attuned to the expectations of the company, but change in human behavior didn't happen overnight. Emily spent countless hours working with the leadership team, reviewing data, and fine-tuning the strategies. They had seen some success: fewer discrimination-related complaints, increased customer satisfaction, and a palpable shift in employee engagement. But Emily knew the work was far from done. She'd pushed hard to ensure that Summit's initiatives were more than just a series of events or training programs. She wanted it to be a sustained cultural shift. The real test was in the company's ability to adapt, to integrate these values into every aspect of their operations. It was late one evening, several months after the first diversity summit, when Emily found herself sitting in her office at Summit's headquarters. The room was quiet, the city lights twinkling outside the window. She was reading through a report on the latest training feedback when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Patricia Winters. "We've received an unexpected complaint. A senior employee in our customer service department reported an issue with the new training methods. We need to discuss." Emily felt a pit form in her stomach. Despite all the progress, she knew they weren't immune to the kind of resistance that had always existed. It was inevitable. Some people would resist change, especially when it challenged their long-held beliefs. Still, it stung. After all the work they had put in, after everything they had fought for, Emily wasn't prepared for this. She quickly typed back, "Let's meet first thing in the morning. I'll be there." The following morning, Emily sat across from Patricia, who had the report spread out in front of her. The look on Patricia's face was one of concern. "We've made a lot of progress, but there are still voices questioning the direction we're taking. Some of the senior team members feel that the training is too broad, that it's addressing issues that aren't necessarily relevant to their daily work." Emily's eyes narrowed as she read through the complaint. It wasn't a criticism of the content of the training itself. It was the discomfort of senior employees who felt like they weren't being given enough space to operate. The concern was that the new systems and training were forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths, challenging their long-held assumptions. And as much as Emily understood the reluctance to change, she also knew that this was the very essence of the challenge. "Patricia," Emily began, her voice calm but firm, "this is exactly what we expected. It's uncomfortable to address these biases. It's challenging to see that what has been accepted for so long is wrong. But that doesn't mean we should back down." Patricia sighed, running her hand through her hair. "I know, but we need buy-in from everyone, especially the senior team. Without them, we can't ensure that these changes will stick. We need their leadership and support to maintain momentum." Emily leaned forward, her mind racing. What if the issue isn't the program? What if the issue is them? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. "It's hard, I get that. But if we're serious about this, we have to ask the tough questions. Are we just making changes for show? Or are we ready to build something that's going to last?" The silence between them stretched on as Patricia mulled over Emily's words. The resistance they were facing wasn't just from the staff. It was embedded in the leadership. Some of the senior executives were pushing back against the idea of real accountability, and that was the crux of the issue. They didn't want to confront the uncomfortable reality that the systems they had built for years had been inherently biased. "This isn't just about policies," Emily continued. "It's about the people in the company. We can't keep letting those who resist steer the ship." Patricia nodded slowly. "So what do? We have to make the hard calls. We need to have direct conversations with the senior team about their role in this. We need to make it clear that this isn't just about diversity for the sake of it. It's about ensuring fairness, and it's about ensuring that everyone, from the ground up, understands that inclusivity is the core of our future." Emily's words were met with a long pause. Patricia knew this wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about changing a few policies or launching a few more training sessions. It was about reshaping the entire culture of the company, and that kind of transformation required sacrifices. After a moment, Patricia spoke again. "All right, we'll set up meetings with the senior team. Let's start by having a few one-on-one conversations with the more resistant members and see if we can shift their perspective. If we can't, then we need to consider whether they're the right people to lead this change." Emily nodded. It was a difficult decision, but it was the right one. The success of this cultural shift depended not only on the employees but on the people who led them. The company needed leaders who were ready to embrace change, not resist it. The following week, Emily found herself in the midst of a series of tense meetings with Summit's senior leadership. It was clear that this was a crucial moment, the kind that would define the future direction of the company and its commitment to real, lasting change. Emily had been tasked with facilitating these one-on-one discussions, and while she knew how important it was to engage the senior team, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was at stake. Summit Airlines had come a long way, But if the resistance from leadership wasn't addressed, all their progress could unravel. She needed to ensure that they not only understood the importance of the changes but also felt personally invested in making them succeed. Her first meeting was with Greg, the chief financial officer, a man who had been with Summit for over 20 years. Greg had always been a strong advocate for maintaining company traditions, and Emily had heard murmurs that he was among the most skeptical about the diversity and inclusion initiatives. As they sat down in the company's sleek conference room, the tension between them was palpable. Greg, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, sat across from her, his arms crossed. He looked at her with a mixture of wariness and frustration, his expression guarded. "Emily," Greg began, his voice low, "I've been with this company for a long time. I understand what you're trying to do here, but I think we need to take a step back. We're pushing a lot of changes, and not all of them make sense." Emily took a deep breath, her resolve steady. "I understand your concerns, Greg, and I respect your experience with Summit. But these changes aren't about diminishing the company's legacy. They're about making sure that legacy is built on fairness, respect, and inclusivity. We can't ignore the realities of bias anymore, not when we're looking to grow, to be an example of what the future of the airline industry can be." Greg shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm all for inclusivity, Emily, but there's a line. We can't compromise on what's worked for us over the years. Our customers expect efficiency, professionalism. They don't care about the color of someone's skin or the clothes they're wearing. They just want the best service possible." Emily leaned forward, meeting Greg's eyes. "I get that, Greg. But here's the thing, what you see as professionalism, what you've considered efficiency, has historically excluded a lot of people. And the customers who don't care about inclusivity, they're not the future. The world is changing, and if we want to stay competitive, if we want to be the company that leads, we need to reflect the diversity of the world we serve." Greg didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be processing her words, his brow furrowed. Emily could see the internal conflict playing out on his face. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. It was never going to be about convincing him in a single conversation, but she hoped she could plant a seed. Finally, Greg spoke again, his tone softer. "I get it, but we can't just change everything overnight. We need to be careful." Emily nodded. "I agree. We don't need to change everything overnight. But we do need to start making more conscious decisions. And that starts with leadership. Starts with you, Greg. I need you to be on board. I need you to lead by example." Greg was silent for a moment before responding with a heavy sigh. "I've always prided myself on doing what's best for the company. I'll consider what you've said, Emily, but I still have a lot of reservations." "It's okay to have reservations," Emily replied gently. "What's important is that we're having this conversation. We can't afford to ignore this anymore. Not as a company, and not as individuals." The conversation ended on a note of quiet reflection, but Emily knew it wasn't a closed case. She had made her points, but Greg's buy-in wasn't guaranteed yet. It would take time for him to see the value of these changes, time for him to understand that this was an investment in Summit's future. The next few days were filled with more similar meetings, each one bringing its own set of challenges. Some conversations were easier than others, with some senior leaders more open to the changes than others. But with every discussion, Emily felt the weight of her purpose grow heavier. This wasn't just about making Summit a better place. It was about challenging the way corporate America functioned, about pushing against the status quo and ensuring that everyone, regardless of background, had an equal chance to succeed. The last meeting was with the CEO of Summit Airlines, Jonathan Hall. He had been more supportive of the diversity initiatives than most, but Emily could sense that even he was starting to feel the pressure. He was a man who valued efficiency and results, and though he spoke the language of inclusivity, she wondered if he truly understood the depth of what needed to be done. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Jonathan began, as they sat across from each other in his office, the city skyline looming behind him. "You've pushed us into new territory, and I see the value in what you're trying to do. But I'm still concerned about the backlash. The industry is changing rapidly, but we've always been a company that values stability. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Stability was important, but so was progress. I understand your concerns, Jonathan, but the reality is, stability can't come at the expense of progress. We need to evolve. Our employees, our customers, they're all changing, and if we don't evolve with them, we risk being left behind. Jonathan studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke. All right, we'll commit to this. We'll push forward with the diversity programs, the new accountability measures. But I need your commitment to make sure this doesn't become another check-the-box initiative. This needs to be real. Emily's heart surged with a quiet sense of victory. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. I promise, Jonathan, this is real. And it will be real for as long as I'm here. The weeks following her last conversation with Jonathan Hall were both exhilarating and exhausting for Emily. Summit Airlines had finally committed to the long-term changes she had been advocating for, but that was only the beginning. The pressure to ensure these initiatives were implemented successfully weighed on her every day. The company had set ambitious goals, and while progress was being made, there were still moments when Emily questioned whether they were moving fast enough. She spent much of her time working with Patricia and the rest of Summit's leadership team, refining the diversity and inclusion program. They had successfully implemented the anonymous feedback systems, and there were positive signs: fewer complaints about discrimination, a stronger sense of employee engagement, but Emily knew they needed to do more to create a truly inclusive environment. The work wasn't over, and it wasn't just about systems and policies. It was about changing people's mindsets, challenging them to confront biases they didn't even know they had. One evening, after a long day of meetings and conference calls, Emily sat in her office, alone, staring out at the city skyline. The soft glow of the streetlights below contrasted sharply with the sharp focus in her mind. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. She picked it up, expecting another work-related message, but it was from Ethan. How are you holding up? I know things have been intense lately. Emily smiled softly, her fingers hovering over the screen. It had been days since they had spoken at length. Ethan had been so understanding throughout her journey, but the truth was, Emily hadn't been fully present in their relationship for weeks. She had been consumed by Summit's work, by the weight of the changes she was trying to implement, and by the relentless feeling that she was constantly walking a tightrope. She typed back, "I'm doing okay. Just a lot going on, you know?" Almost instantly, Ethan replied, "I know it's been hard, but don't forget you're not alone in this. I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Her chest tightened with a mix of appreciation and guilt. She had been so focused on the mission, on making a difference, that she had neglected the very thing that had always grounded her, her relationship with Ethan. She knew he was right. She couldn't keep carrying this burden on her own. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Patricia Winters. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Patricia," she said, trying to sound calm despite the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. "Emily," Patricia's voice crackled through the phone. "I need to talk to you. There's been an issue." Emily's heart sank. "What's going on?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "There's been some pushback from a few members of the senior team," Patricia said, her tone serious. "They're questioning the direction of the program. They feel like the cultural changes we've implemented are going too far, too fast. I need you to come in tomorrow morning. We need to address this head-on." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't the first time she had encountered resistance from the senior leadership team, but the fact that it was escalating now, after everything they had worked for, was unsettling. "I'll be there first thing," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside her. As she ended the call, Emily leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen of her phone. This was exactly the challenge she had been bracing for. Summit Airlines had made strides in its diversity and inclusion initiatives, but the reality of true cultural change was that it would always meet resistance from those who were uncomfortable with it. The very people she had worked so hard to convince were now the ones questioning whether they were pushing too hard. The thoughts swirled in Emily's mind as she prepared herself for the following morning. She had pushed for change because it was the right thing to do, because she knew that Summit could be a leader in creating a more inclusive workplace. But now, as the pressure mounted, she had to decide how far she was willing to go to see it through. The next morning, Emily arrived early at Summit Airlines headquarters, her mind heavy with the conversation she had to navigate. She entered the building, her footsteps echoing in the quiet early morning. The usual hum of activity hadn't yet taken over the office, and the silence gave her a moment to gather her thoughts. Today, she knew, was going to be a turning point. As she entered the conference room, Patricia was already there, flipping through a stack of papers. She looked up, offering Emily a tired smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice strained. "I wish it were under better circumstances." Emily nodded, sitting down across from Patricia. "What's going on?" "We've received feedback from some of the senior leadership team," Patricia explained, her tone neutral but with a hint of frustration. "They're questioning the pace of the changes we've implemented. Specifically, they're worried that we're alienating some of our long-term employees, the ones who are resistant to the cultural shift." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had anticipated resistance, but this felt different. These were the people she had worked alongside, the ones who had initially given their support. To hear they were now hesitating, questioning the vision, made her feel like everything was at risk. "They don't get it," Emily said softly, her voice edged with frustration. "I'm not trying to make everyone uncomfortable for the sake of it. I'm doing this because the company needs to change, or will be left behind." "I know, Emily," Patricia replied, her expression sympathetic. "But you're up against a challenge that requires more than just logic and progress. You need to meet these people where they are, understand their fears. They've been in positions of power for years, and suddenly, they're being asked to reconsider their assumptions, their leadership style, even their place in the company's future. That's terrifying for some people." Emily leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She had always known that systemic change was difficult. But hearing Patricia's words made the challenge seem even greater than she had imagined. The resistance wasn't just about the policies they were trying to implement. It was about power, comfort, and a way of life that many of Summit's senior leaders had built over decades. "I can't keep watering down what we're doing," Emily said, her voice firm. "I've fought too hard to let these people undermine everything we've worked for. If they're truly committed to making Summit a better company, they need to embrace this. They don't have the luxury of staying in their comfort zones." Patricia met her gaze, her eyes reflecting the same weariness Emily felt. "I agree, but we can't make this change happen if we don't have the support of the people at the top. We need them on board, not just in theory, but in practice. It's time to have those tough conversations." Emily sighed. "So what do we do now?" Patricia's expression softened. "We go directly to the heart of the issue. We sit down with them, person by person, and address their concerns head-on. We listen. We remind them of why we're doing this and why it's essential for the future of Summit Airlines." Emily knew Patricia was right, but she also understood the gravity of what was being asked. This wasn't going to be easy, and the people in the room weren't just colleagues. They were people whose opinions and actions could either make or break the success of the program. If the senior leadership didn't align with the new values, the work Emily had put in would be for nothing. The first meeting was with Greg, the chief financial officer, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics. Emily had already spoken with him a few weeks ago, but the conversation hadn't gone as well as she had hoped. Now it was time to face him again, this time with Patricia by her side. Emily wasn't sure what kind of reception they would receive, but she had to try. They walked into Greg's office, where he was sitting behind his desk, reviewing some spreadsheets. When he saw them enter, he put the papers aside and greeted them with a curt nod. "Morning, Greg," Emily said, her tone neutral but firm. "Morning," he replied, not bothering to stand up. Patricia took the lead. "We wanted to have an open discussion with you about the current direction of the company's diversity and inclusion efforts. We know there have been some concerns from your end, and we'd like to hear more about them." Greg's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent for a moment. He was a man who preferred to hold his cards close to his chest. "I'm all for inclusivity," he said slowly, "but some of these changes are happening too fast. You can't just force people to accept new ideas, especially when they feel like they're being pushed out of their positions. Emily felt the tension rise, but she kept her voice steady. Greg, this isn't about pushing people out. This is about making sure everyone, no matter who they are, feels they belong. If Summit is going to grow, we have to change the way we think about leadership and opportunity. We need to include voices that have been ignored for too long. And we need you to lead this change. Greg looked at her, his expression skeptical. I get what you're saying, but we can't change everything overnight. We risk alienating the people who've been here the longest. They've built this company, Emily. You can't just push them aside. Patricia spoke next, her tone gentle but firm. We're not asking anyone to be pushed aside, Greg, but we are asking for openness. You're a leader here. If you want Summit to thrive in the future, you need to be part of the solution, not part of the resistance. Greg fell silent, his gaze flickering between Emily and Patricia. The room was heavy with expectation. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers being shuffled. Emily sat at the head of the conference table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Patricia was beside her, a stack of reports in her lap, her eyes focused intently on the documents. Across the table, the senior leadership team of Summit Airlines sat, some of them still hesitant, others simply tired. The last few months had been exhausting for everyone, but today felt different. Today, Emily was ready to push forward, to ensure the work they had done was not only acknowledged but sustained. The previous conversations with Greg and the others had planted the seeds of doubt, but they had also provided clarity. Summit Airlines was at a crossroads. They could either continue down the path of real, meaningful change, or they could slip back into old habits. There was no middle ground. Emily glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost time to begin. She had worked hard to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let any resistance derail their progress. The meeting was set to discuss the next phase of Summit's transformation, an initiative to track and assess the long-term impact of the diversity and inclusion programs they had put in place. She took a deep breath and stood up as the last few members filed in. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sense of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. But she was ready. This was her chance to prove that all the work, all the struggle was worth it. She wasn't just fighting for Summit Airlines to be a better company. She was fighting for a future where all employees, regardless of their background, felt valued and heard. Patricia stood with her, and they both faced the room. Thank you all for being here today. Emily began, her voice steady but firm. As you know, Summit Airlines has made significant progress in its diversity and inclusion efforts. But today, we're not here to congratulate ourselves. We're here to talk about what comes next. She paused, making sure she had their attention. We've taken important steps toward creating an inclusive culture, but this is just the beginning. We need to make sure that these changes aren't temporary. We need a system of accountability, one that ensures the work we've started will continue long after this meeting ends. The room was silent, but Emily could see the hesitation in the eyes of a few of the senior leaders. They had all supported the initiatives to some degree, but there was still some uncertainty about the full commitment needed to bring these changes to fruition. I've heard concerns, Emily continued, that we're moving too quickly, that we're alienating longtime employees, and that this initiative might not be sustainable. I get it. Change is uncomfortable. But if we're not uncomfortable, then we're not doing enough. If we're not pushing boundaries, we're not progressing. Patricia stepped forward, adding, it's important to understand that this isn't just a box to check. This is about transforming how we think, how we work together, and how we engage with our passengers. It's not just about policies. It's about our culture, and that takes time. Emily nodded, acknowledging Patricia's words. Then she turned back to the group. We need your buy-in, she said, and not just your words of support, but your actions. If we're going to make this work, it has to be a top-down approach. We're not just changing procedures. We're changing the way we think about leadership, about success, and about the people we serve. The room was still tense, but Emily could feel a shift. There were murmurs of agreement, a few nods, and even some tentative smiles. The resistance was there, but it wasn't as strong as it had been. She could see the cracks in the old systems, the ones that had held Summit Airlines together for so long. And for the first time in a while, she felt like they were all starting to crack open, ready for something new. "We've already made strides," Emily said, her voice more confident now. "We've implemented the anonymous feedback systems. We've revised our training programs. We've made sure that inclusivity is part of every conversation we're having. But we can't stop there. We need to track our progress, ensure the changes we've made are sustainable, and adjust as needed." One of the senior leaders, James, raised his hand. "Emily, I agree with what you're saying, but I think we need to acknowledge the concerns some of the team members have. We don't want to lose the people who have helped build Summit to what it is today. How do we ensure that they feel included in this process?" Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair concern, James. But I also think we need to understand that the old ways weren't inclusive. It's not about leaving people behind. It's about creating a place where everyone has a chance to succeed. If they're resistant to change, then we have to find ways to bring them along, not drag them along. This is a cultural shift, not a mandate. We have to lead by example." The room fell quiet again as the team absorbed Emily's words. She could see the leaders processing the idea of cultural transformation, the complexity of balancing inclusivity with the fear of alienating their existing workforce. But Emily knew they had to take this step. They couldn't go back. The conversation shifted after Emily's words, with more leaders joining in with cautious support. The resistance was still palpable, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a recognition in the room that Emily's vision for Summit Airlines was not just an abstract idea. It was essential for the company's survival in a changing world. Slowly, the room began to warm, as the team realized that their next steps would define the company's future. As the meeting continued, Patricia and Emily worked through the specifics of how they would implement ongoing assessments and adjust the program over time. There was talk of forming a new committee to oversee the sustainability of the diversity and inclusion efforts. This committee would be responsible for reviewing employee feedback regularly, tracking changes in company culture, and ensuring that inclusivity became an organic part of Summit's identity. It wasn't a one-time fix. It was a long-term commitment. Emily felt a sense of cautious optimism building. The support from the leadership team was growing, even if it was tempered by uncertainty. But she knew this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Summit was not just checking off boxes anymore. They were embracing a cultural transformation, one that would ripple through every department, every level of the company. As the meeting drew to a close, Jonathan Hall, the CEO of Summit Airlines, finally spoke. "Emily, I have to say, you've made a compelling case. We've had our reservations, but it's clear that this is the right direction for Summit. I know there's still a long road ahead, but I want you to know that we're all in. We will support you and the team as you continue to push forward." Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders at Jonathan's words. He had always been a supportive figure, but hearing him express his full commitment to the initiative made all the difference. "Thank you, Jonathan," she said, her voice steady. "This won't be easy, but together, we can make this change last." Patricia smiled at Emily, her eyes filled with pride. It had taken months of hard work, of pushing against resistance, and of challenging the status quo. But finally, Summit Airlines was on the path to becoming the inclusive company Emily had always believed it could be. As the meeting ended, Emily stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. It was early evening, and the skyline was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, knowing that the battle for change wasn't over, but that it had taken an important step forward. The room behind her buzzed with post-meeting discussions, but she took a moment to herself. This wasn't just her victory, it was the victory of everyone who had fought for inclusivity, who had been overlooked or dismissed for who they were. She thought back to the flight months ago, when she had been humiliated by the actions of the flight attendants. That moment had set her on this path, igniting a fire in her to make real change. And now, standing at the threshold of something truly transformative, Emily felt the full weight of her journey. She hadn't just created a policy. She had created a new reality for the company, for its employees, and for its passengers. She had helped redefine what it meant to be a leader, not by commanding authority, but by leading with empathy, integrity, and a commitment to doing the right thing. As she turned back to the room, Patricia caught her eye. "You did it, Emily," she said with a smile. Emily nodded, but her thoughts were already on what came next. This was only the beginning. The road to true inclusivity was long, and it would require constant vigilance, but Summit was no longer a company stuck in the past. They had made a promise, and now they were determined to keep it.